Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was the middle of November, a cold, dreary Tuesday night. I remember it well because it was my first full shift at Evergreen Haven, the elder care facility where I had recently started working as a nurse. I had just turned 24, and though I was new, I had already experienced my share of stressful nights. But this night would be different. It would be the one I'd never forget. Evergreen Haven specialized in patients with Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but I loved the idea of caring for people in their final years, providing them some comfort, even as their memories slipped away. My shift started at 10 p.m. and was supposed to end at 6 a.m., but I often stayed later. The night shift wasn't easy. The hours dragged, and the darkness outside seemed to seep into the hallways, making everything feel a little more oppressive. It was the kind of job that could wear you down, but I thought I was handling it well. Until that night. One of my patients was a woman named Mabel, mid-70s, pale skin, her once blonde hair now white as snow. She had been at Evergreen Haven for almost 3 years, diagnosed with late-stage Alzheimer's. Mabel was often restless, which wasn't unusual for patients with her condition, but there was something different about her that night. She seemed on edge more than usual. "Claire," she said, her voice trembling as I checked her vitals. "He's in here again. He won't leave me alone." I froze for a moment, my hand resting on the blood pressure cuff. "Who, Mabel? Who's in here?" "The man in black," she whispered, her eyes darting to the corner of the room. "He stands there, just watching. He's always watching." I followed her gaze, but of course, there was nothing. Just the pale walls, the quiet hum of the heater, and the low glow from the hallway light. My heart skipped a beat, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just Mabel's mind playing tricks on her. "Mabel," I said gently, kneeling down beside her bed. "There's no one here. It's just you and me. Try to get some sleep, okay?" She shook her head violently, her thin hands gripping my arm with surprising strength. "No, Claire! You don't understand. He's real. He's always been real. He's in here, and he's watching us right now." I didn't know what to say. I had dealt with hallucinations before, but the way she said it, the fear in her voice, it got under my skin. I did my best to comfort her, assuring her that I'd keep an eye out and that she was safe. Eventually, after some soft music and a warm cup of tea, she calmed down enough to drift off into a restless sleep. The rest of the ward was quiet. Most of the other patients were already asleep. The air felt heavy that night, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off Mabel's words, but they lingered. The idea of someone or something watching her. Watching me. I laughed it off, told myself it was nothing. Just the ramblings of an old, confused mind. But then came the incident in the linen closet. Around 2 a.m., I realized we were running low on fresh towels, so I made my way to the small storage room down the hall. The corridor was dimly lit, as usual, the faint buzzing of the fluorescent lights echoing in the empty space. I pulled open the door to the linen closet, stepping inside. It was a tight, narrow room lined with shelves on either side, filled with towels, sheets, and basic medical supplies. I reached up to grab a fresh stack of towels when I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. It was large, heavy, and cold. I jumped, spinning around so fast I almost knocked over the cart behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. I stood there, frozen, my breath catching in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, but the only thing in sight was the shelves and the linen. I could still feel the weight of the hand on my shoulder, even though it was gone. My heart was pounding in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I told myself it had to be my imagination, that maybe I had brushed against something. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. It was too real. Too sudden. And then I saw him. As I turned toward the door, there he was, just beyond the glass window of the door. A man dressed all in black, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes piercing as they stared directly into mine. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me, a small, twisted smile curling on his lips. I felt my knees go weak, my mind screaming for me to run, to do anything. But I was frozen in place, paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. The smile on his face widened, as if he knew exactly what I was feeling. I don't know how long I stood there, unable to move, unable to think. It felt like an eternity, but it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. Finally, the adrenaline kicked in, and I screamed. Loud. The sound seemed to snap me out of whatever trance I had been in. I stumbled backward, crashing into the shelves as I bolted for the door. As I reached the hallway, another nurse, Jenny, came running toward me, her face pale with concern. "Claire, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I tried to explain, tried to tell her about the man, but when we looked back into the linen closet, there was no one there. Nothing. Jenny checked the nearby halls, but of course, no one was around. It was just me, her, and the quiet, empty corridors. "You probably just spooked yourself," Jenny said, her voice trying to sound calm, but I could tell she didn't quite believe her own words. "You're tired. It's a long shift." I nodded, even though I knew what I saw. I wasn't imagining it. That man, he was there. As we walked back to the nurse's station, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner more sinister. The rest of the night crawled by. I avoided the storage room, avoided any area where I might be alone. But Mabel didn't sleep. When I checked on her again, her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling. "He's here, isn't he?" she asked, her voice hoarse. I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to say anymore. The rest of the shift passed in a blur, but that image, the man in black with that smile, stayed with me long after the sun came up. I couldn't sleep that day. After my shift ended, I dragged myself home, exhausted and shaken, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw him, the man in black. His pale face, the twisted smile, the way he stood perfectly still, as if he was waiting for something. I spent hours lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head. I hadn't been getting enough sleep, and my nerves were frayed. It had to be a hallucination. That was the only explanation. But deep down I knew. I knew it was real. By the time my next shift came around, I was a wreck. My hands shook as I got ready, my stomach twisted in knots. I thought about calling in sick, telling the head nurse that I couldn't make it, but I knew that would only raise questions. I needed this job. And besides, what would I say? That I saw a ghost? No one would believe me. I barely believed it myself. When I got back to Evergreen Haven, everything seemed normal, at least, as normal as it could be. The patients were in their rooms, the halls were quiet, and the other nurses greeted me with the usual tired smiles. But the moment I stepped onto the ward, I felt it again. That same heavy, oppressive feeling, like the air itself was thicker. It was colder too, though the heating system was working fine. I tried to focus on my tasks, pushing the fear to the back of my mind. Mabel was my first stop. As I entered her room, I found her sitting up in bed, wide awake. Her face was pale, her eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. She looked at me as soon as I walked in, and I could tell she had been waiting for me. "Claire," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He was here again. Last night. After you left." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do you mean, Mabel?" She stared at me with those haunted eyes, her hands trembling as they clutched the blanket. "The man in black. He came into my room. He stood right there." She pointed to the same corner as before, the one she had been so fixated on. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. He just stood there, watching. My heart pounded in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Mabel, it's just your mind playing tricks on you. You're safe here. There's no one in your room." She shook her head violently, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, Claire. He's real. He's real, and he's coming for me. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to tell her it was just a nightmare. But after what I had seen the night before, I couldn't shake the feeling that she might be right. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't normal. I stayed with Mabel for a while, holding her hand and trying to calm her down. Eventually, she fell asleep, though it was clear she wasn't at peace. As I left her room, I couldn't help but glance at the corner where she had pointed. It was just a shadow, a dark space in the room, but it felt wrong. Like something was there, watching. The rest of the night was uneventful, at least for a while. I went about my duties, trying to distract myself from the creeping fear that gnawed at the edges of my mind. But that feeling never left. The sense that I wasn't alone, that someone, or something, was watching me. It wasn't until around 3 a.m. that things started to unravel again. I was in the hallway, heading back to the nurse's station after checking out another patient, when I heard it, a low whisper. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my ears. "Claire!" The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a bolt of terror through me. I turned, scanning the hallway, but it was empty. The lights flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the walls. "Claire!" This time, it was louder, clearer. I knew it wasn't my imagination. Someone was calling my name. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to find out where the voice was coming from. And then I saw him again. He was standing at the far end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the light. The same man, dressed all in black, his face pale and emotionless, his eyes fixed on me. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, watching. I couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of lead, too heavy to move. All I could do was stare at him, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this real? Before I could react, the lights in the hallway flickered again, and for a split second, everything went dark. When the lights came back on, he was gone. I stood there, trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't leave. Not yet. I had to check on Mabel. I rushed to her room, throwing open the door. She was awake, sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. "He's here, isn't he?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there, frozen, my mind racing. And then Mabel did something that sent a chill down my spine. She looked past me, her eyes widening in fear. Slowly, she pointed to the corner of the room, the same corner she had pointed to before. "He's here," she said again, her voice trembling. "He's right behind you." I turned, my breath catching in my throat, but the corner was empty. Nothing was there. But I knew he was there. Before I could say anything, Mabel started to scream. It was a blood-curdling scream, filled with terror. She thrashed in her bed, pulling at the blankets, her eyes wild with fear. I tried to calm her down, but she wouldn't stop. "He's coming for me!" she screamed. "He's coming! Get him away from me!" Other nurses rushed in, trying to restrain her, trying to calm her down, but nothing worked. It took nearly half an hour to sedate her, but even then, she kept whispering about the man in black. About how he was coming for her. I couldn't take it anymore. As soon as Mabel was calm, I went to the head nurse and told her I couldn't stay. I needed to leave. She didn't ask many questions, probably sensing the panic in my voice. They transferred me to a different ward for the rest of the night, away from Mabel's room. Away from that corner. The next morning, I texted the head nurse. I quit. I couldn't go back. Whatever had happened that night, whatever Mabel had seen, whatever I had seen, it was too much. I didn't want to know more. I didn't want to face it again. I've never had any mental health issues. Never hallucinated before. But what happened that night, it was real. I don't care what anyone says. It was real. And I pray to God I never see him again. I never thought my first date with Amanda would lead me to one of the scariest nights of my life. We met on Tinder, like a lot of people do these days. She was charming, mysterious, and had this strange love for urban exploration. It was one of the first things she brought up in our conversations. I'll admit, I found it a little odd, but it also intrigued me. I mean, how many people suggest exploring an abandoned hospital as a first date? It had a thrill to it, something unique, something dangerous. When Amanda first suggested it, I thought she was joking. But her voice was steady, and she seemed genuinely excited about it. She explained how she'd been to this old, abandoned hospital a few times and knew exactly how to sneak in. "It's not as hard as you think," she had said. "Cops patrol the area, but they never really go inside. Too spooky for them, I guess." I wasn't one to back down from a challenge, especially one that seemed so unconventional. So I agreed. The night was cool, with a thin layer of fog rolling across the streets as I drove to Amanda's place. She lived about 15 minutes from me, and the plan was for me to pick her up, and we'd drive together to the hospital. When she got into my car, I noticed her excitement. She was dressed casually, but there was something about the way she moved, the confidence in her voice, that made me feel like she had done this a million times before. And maybe she had. We drove in relative silence for about 20 minutes until we arrived at the hospital. I don't know what I was expecting, but the sight of the place gave me a bad feeling. The building loomed over us, dark and decaying, like it was watching us, waiting for us to come closer. The windows were either broken or boarded up, and the entrance was covered in graffiti, some of it crude, but some of it seemed almost ritualistic. I wasn't sure if that was just my imagination, but it didn't help settle the growing pit in my stomach. Amanda had us park in a small dead-end street, hidden from view. "This is where I usually go," she said as she grabbed her backpack from the back seat. Inside, I could see flashlights, a small first aid kit, and a few other things that made me think she had really prepared for this. She led the way to a broken window near the basement. "This is the easiest way in," she whispered, as if the hospital might hear us. I followed her through the opening, feeling the cool air from inside the building brush against my skin. The air smelled stale, like mildew and old rot. The darkness swallowed us quickly, but Amanda moved with purpose, like she knew every corner of the place. We walked through the basement in near silence, our flashlights barely cutting through the thick, dusty air. Pipes creaked overhead, and I could hear the distant dripping of water somewhere deeper in the building. Every sound seemed amplified by the silence. Once we reached the first floor, things started to feel even more unsettling. The walls were covered in peeling paint, and old hospital beds and broken medical equipment were scattered throughout the hallways. It looked like the place had been abandoned for decades, though Amanda had told me it had only been left to rot in the late 90s. She told me stories about how she'd explored this place with friends before, about strange things she'd seen, but I just laughed it off. I wasn't laughing anymore. As we made our way down one of the main hallways, we heard it, a door creaking open somewhere in the distance. Amanda immediately turned off her flashlight, motioning for me to do the same. We stood there, in the pitch black, our hearts racing. I could hear my own breathing, shallow and fast. We waited, listening for any other sounds, but nothing followed. After what felt like an eternity, Amanda whispered, "It's probably just the wind. Happens all the time." But then there was another sound. This time, it was louder, a thud, like something heavy had fallen nearby. Both of us froze. This wasn't just the wind. Amanda's voice was shaky when she spoke again. "It could be someone else exploring. It's not uncommon for people to come here. Should we check it out?" I asked, my voice a bit too loud in the silence. She shook her head. "Let's keep moving." We continued through the building, but the atmosphere had shifted. The excitement that Amanda had earlier was now replaced with a quiet tension. I could feel it too, the growing sense that we weren't alone. We passed by a few rooms with doors hanging off their hinges, and I could swear I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. But every time I turned my head, there was nothing. Then, As we reached a stairwell leading up to the second floor, we heard it again, footsteps. This time, they were unmistakable. Someone was coming down the stairs. We stopped dead in our tracks, listening. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like whoever it was knew we were there and was taking their time. Amanda turned to me, her eyes wide. "We need to go," she whispered. Without another word, we turned and hurried back down the hallway, trying to stay quiet but moving as fast as we could. The footsteps followed. Whoever it was, they were getting closer. We ducked into a side room, hoping to lose them, but as we entered, the room felt wrong. The air was thick, like we were walking into something we shouldn't have. We turned off our flashlights and stood in the dark, listening to the footsteps stop just outside the door. My heart was pounding in my chest. I could feel Amanda's breath next to me, shallow and quick. Whoever it was, they stood there for what felt like an eternity. And then, the footsteps started again, this time moving away. We waited a few more moments before Amanda nudged me. "Come on," she whispered. We moved quietly through the building, winding through a maze of dark hallways until we found ourselves on a small rooftop terrace. The cool night air hit us, and for a moment, I felt like we were safe. We sat down to catch our breath, and Amanda gave me a shaky smile. "I've never heard footsteps like that before," she admitted. "That was new." I didn't respond. I was too busy trying to convince myself that we were still alone. But the night was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. Sitting on that rooftop, I thought we were finally out of danger, that the worst was behind us. The open air, the faint breeze, everything felt calmer, safer. Amanda and I exchanged nervous laughs, trying to shake off the fear that had settled over us like a heavy blanket. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Amanda stood up, walking to the edge of the roof to peer over. "It's weird," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every time I've been here, it's never felt like this." Her eyes flicked back to me. "Like we're being watched." I tried to laugh, but it came out more like a strangled cough. "Maybe it's just your imagination," I offered, though I wasn't convinced myself. The sensation of being watched, the footsteps following us, it was all too real. She glanced back over the edge one last time before turning to face me. "We should head back inside. We can take the side stairs down and be out of here in no time." I nodded, but my legs didn't feel ready to move just yet. I looked back at the broken window we had come through to get to the roof, the jagged glass glinting faintly in the moonlight. That feeling of safety quickly dissipated as I stared at it, realizing we had to go back through that shattered entryway and into the belly of the beast. Reluctantly, I followed Amanda. She led the way once more, and as she slid through the broken window, I felt a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread settle over me like a cold hand on my shoulder. Inside the building, it was darker than ever, our flashlights barely illuminating the narrow corridor ahead. The silence was unnerving, as if the entire hospital was holding its breath. We made our way carefully along the beams, trying not to make any noise. The floors below us creaked under our weight, but it wasn't enough to calm my nerves. Every step felt precarious, like we were one wrong move away from a catastrophe. We reached a section where the floor had partially collapsed, leaving a long gap that spanned about 10 feet. Amanda went first, stepping lightly across the narrow wooden plank that bridged the drop. The space below was a shadowy abyss. Falling would have meant a serious injury, if not worse. I followed, my breath catching in my throat with every wobble of the board. Halfway across, I heard it. A faint, dragging sound, like something being pulled across the floor. I froze, glancing down. That's when I saw him. Directly below us, standing in the darkness, was a man. He was dressed in worn, dirty clothes, a black jacket and torn jeans, and his head was covered by a faded Carhartt beanie. His face was illuminated only by the faint beam of Amanda's flashlight, which she hadn't yet noticed had revealed him. He was smiling. Not a friendly smile. This was something darker, something that chilled my blood. "Come on down," he called, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "I've been waiting for you." Amanda froze at the sound of his voice. She glanced down, her face draining of color when she saw him. "Shit," she whispered. "We need to go. Now." "Are you a cop?" I asked, my voice unsteady, though I knew he wasn't. He didn't answer, just stood there, smiling up at us, his hands hanging loosely by his sides. Amanda tugged at my arm, pulling me toward the other side of the gap. "Don't ask him questions. Let's just move." We hurried along the beam, trying to put distance between us and the man. Behind us, I could hear him moving, slow, deliberate footsteps echoing up from the floor below. He wasn't rushing, but he wasn't far behind either. It was like he knew exactly where we were headed and had no need to hurry. We scrambled through a maze of hallways, the building's layout becoming increasingly disorienting. I had lost all sense of direction. Amanda seemed to know where she was going, but her usual confidence was gone. She was moving faster, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. As we rounded a corner, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from behind us, faster now, as if the man had picked up his pace. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. We hit a stairwell, and without hesitation, Amanda started down. The stairs groaned under our weight, each step sounding like it might give way. As we descended, the footsteps above us grew louder, more frantic. He was chasing us now. "He's coming!" I shouted, my voice cracking with fear. "I know!" Amanda replied, her voice just as panicked. "We need to get to the basement. There's another way out." We flew down the stairs, the echo of our footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. The man's footsteps were louder now, closer, like he was right on top of us. I could hear his heavy breathing, the soft shuffle of his feet as he descended the stairs behind us. We reached the basement, our flashlights flickering in the damp, moldy air. The basement was a labyrinth of old machinery, storage rooms, and long-forgotten debris. It felt like we were running through a tomb. Every shadow seemed to move, every corner a potential hiding place for the man who was stalking us. "We're almost there," Amanda panted, her voice barely above a whisper as she led us through the final hallway. The window we had crawled through was just ahead, but before we could reach it, the footsteps stopped. Silence. We both froze, listening, our hearts pounding in our ears. I couldn't hear him anymore. No footsteps, no breathing, nothing. "He's gone?" I whispered, not daring to believe it. Amanda shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, he's not!" And then I felt it, a sharp tug at my ankle. I screamed and kicked wildly, my foot connecting with something solid. Amanda grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the window as hard as she could. I didn't dare look back. We scrambled through the broken window, the jagged glass cutting into my arms as I hauled myself through. The moment I hit the ground outside, I turned around, expecting to see the man grabbing at my legs, pulling me back into the darkness. But there was nothing there. We didn't stop to question it. We ran, sprinting across the overgrown lot toward the car, not looking back. The night seemed to close in around us, the fog thickening as we reached the car. We jumped in, slammed the doors, and locked them in unison. For a few moments, we just sat there, catching our breath, staring at the hospital in the rearview mirror. The building stood silent still. No movement. No sign of the man. Amanda started the car, her hands shaking. "We're not going back," she said, her voice firm. I nodded, unable to find my voice. We drove away in silence, not stopping until we reached the nearest Wendy's, where we parked and sat in the car for an hour, just trying to process what had happened. Neither of us said much. We didn't need to. I took Amanda home after that, and we didn't talk about it again for weeks. When we finally did, it was to agree that we wouldn't be going back to that hospital, ever. We dated for a few months after that, but something had shifted between us. Maybe it was the fear, the shared trauma of that night, but eventually, we decided we were better off as friends. Even now, years later, I can still hear his voice in my head. "Come on down. I've been waiting for you." I don't think I'll ever forget it. 3 years ago, my life took a terrifying turn. I live in southern Florida with my husband, but at the time, it was just the two of us, no kids, no pets, just us. Our life was simple, busy with work, and punctuated by the occasional beach weekend. But all of that simplicity shattered one morning when I woke up with the worst headache of my life. At first, I thought it was just another migraine. I've had them before, but this pain was different. It was sharp, almost electric, pulsing through my skull like someone was hammering inside my head. I didn't think much of it initially. I figured it would go away with some aspirin and rest. But as the day went on, it only got worse. I became unbearably drowsy, like I couldn't keep my eyes open even if I tried. Nausea kicked in. My appetite disappeared entirely, and to top it off, I began to experience something far more unsettling: hallucinations. The first one happened that afternoon. My husband, Ben, was at work. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep off the pain when I heard it, a child's voice. "Mommy!" It called, soft but clear, coming from downstairs. My heart skipped a beat. It was impossible. We didn't have kids, and the neighborhood was quiet. I knew no one had entered the house. I lay there, frozen, my brain trying to process whether what I just heard was real. But curiosity, or perhaps fear, got the best of me. I forced myself out of bed, my legs trembling as I stumbled downstairs. No one was there. The house was just as I'd left it, empty, still, and quiet. The silence felt oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The pain in my head intensified, and I felt nauseous again, so I went back to bed, telling myself it was all in my head. Just a side effect of the headache, I thought. Then it happened again, later that evening. This time, I heard a different voice, not a child's, but distinctly human. A man's voice whispered, "Hello?" Soft but close, as if the speaker was standing right beside me. I jerked awake, terrified. The room was spinning, and the nausea hit me so hard I barely made it to the bathroom before throwing up. My mind raced. I thought I was losing it. I called Ben, trying to stay calm. I told him I was hearing voices, children's voices, and now this strange man's voice. He didn't hesitate. He said he'd come home right away, that we'd go to the hospital. I was glad he was coming, but fear still gnawed at me. I was alone in the house for at least another hour. The pain was so bad I could barely sit up. I lay there in the darkened room, eyes closed, gripping the edge of the bed, trying to keep the room from spinning. That's when I heard it again, a third voice, softer than the others, murmuring something indecipherable. My skin crawled with terror, and I prayed for Ben to come home. When we finally arrived at the hospital, the doctors didn't waste any time. They ran test after test, and soon enough, they had their diagnosis: bacterial meningitis. It's rare, they told me, and it's extremely dangerous. The infection had made its way to my brain, and if I hadn't come in when I did, it could have killed me. I was immediately put on 4 antibiotics. The doctors said I would need to stay in the hospital for at least a week, maybe longer, depending on how my body responded. Ben stayed with me that night, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, holding my hand. He was worried but relieved that we'd caught it in time. By 10 p.m., he had to go home to get some rest and prepare for work the next day. He promised. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me after the nurse's revelation. David, my ex-husband, hadn't crossed my mind in years. We parted ways after a messy, tumultuous relationship, and I had made peace with the fact that I would likely never see him again. But now, not only had he invaded my dreams, but according to the nurse, he had physically shown up in my hospital room. The whole thing felt impossible, and yet, here I was, grappling with the chilling reality of it all. I immediately called Ben and told him what had happened. He was already concerned about my health, but hearing that my ex-husband had allegedly shown up at the hospital in the middle of the night sent him into a tailspin of worry. He promised he would leave work early to be with me, but in the meantime, I was stuck in that sterile hospital room with nothing but my thoughts, and the creeping suspicion that something wasn't right. As I lay there, staring at the chair beside my bed, the events of the past few days replayed in my head like a broken record. The voices I'd heard in the house, the hallucinations that had started even before we knew what was wrong with me, the vivid dream of David's cold touch, and now this. I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't anymore. The doctors had explained that the antibiotics could cause delirium, and that the infection itself could lead to hallucinations, but this felt different, like something far more sinister was at play. By the time Ben arrived that evening, I was a wreck. I told him everything, the dream, the chair, the nurse's confirmation that David had visited. He was as confused as I was. "There's no way David could have known you were here," Ben said, pacing the room. "We haven't spoken to him in years. How would he even find out?" That's when it hit me. I hadn't thought about it until then, but there was only one way David could have known I was in the hospital. He had to have been watching me. I felt the blood drain from my face as I realized the full weight of what that meant. "He's been following us," I whispered, the words barely making it past my lips. Ben stopped pacing and looked at me. His face was a mixture of disbelief and anger. "That's insane. You're telling me he's been stalking us this whole time, and we didn't notice?" I didn't have an answer for him. It sounded insane, but nothing about this situation made sense anymore. We sat in silence for a while, both trying to process the enormity of what I had just said. Eventually, Ben suggested we confront David directly. "I'll call him," he said, pulling out his phone. "We'll get to the bottom of this." But I stopped him. "No. Let me do it. I need to hear what he has to say." Ben hesitated but ultimately handed me the phone. My hands shook as I scrolled through my contacts and found David's number. It had been so long since I'd even looked at it, but there it was, unchanged. I pressed the call button, and the phone rang. And rang. And rang. Just when I thought he wasn't going to answer, I heard his voice on the other end. "Hello?" Hearing his voice again after all this time sent a shiver down my spine. It was strange how familiar it felt, yet at the same time, so foreign. For a moment, I didn't know what to say. Then I forced the words out. "David, it's me. I'm in the hospital. Did you come to visit me last night?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a second, I thought he had hung up. But then he spoke, his voice calm and measured, as if we were discussing something mundane. "Yes, I came by." His admission made my heart race. My grip tightened on the phone. "Why? How did you even know I was here?" David's response was chillingly nonchalant. "I have my ways. I wanted to see how you were doing. It's been a long time." "A long time?" That was his explanation. After years of no contact, he just decided to show up in the middle of the night at my hospital bed, acting like it was a normal thing to do. Anger surged through me, but there was something more, a creeping sense of danger, like I was walking into a trap. "You threatened Ben," I said, my voice trembling. "In the dream, or whatever it was, you said you could kill him. Why, David? What's going on?" For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then David laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh, it was cold, mocking. "You're confused, Ellie," he said, using the nickname I hadn't heard in years. "You've always had a vivid imagination." I could feel my stomach drop. "Don't lie to me," I snapped. "If you come near me or Ben again, I will go to the police." "I'm serious, David." His voice changed then, darkening, a low threat laced within his words. "You can't get rid of me that easily, Ellie. You never could." I hung up before he could say anything else, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Ben was staring at me, waiting for an explanation, but I couldn't speak. All I could do was sit there, the weight of David's words pressing down on me like a vice. I didn't tell Ben about the threat. I couldn't. I didn't even know if it had really happened or if it was just another hallucination, some twisted side effect of the antibiotics and the infection. I didn't want to make things worse by involving the police if there was a chance this was all in my head. For the next few days, I remained in the hospital, and nothing unusual happened. The voices stopped, the dreams faded, and I started to feel like myself again. But the unease lingered, a constant presence in the back of my mind.